We have 3 lectures in this series. They alternate each year or every other year with the Taylor Lectures, which are in constructive theology. And I have to just mention a few of the people who've given these lectures. If you know anything about New Testament scholarship, you'll recognize some of these names. Rudolf Bultmann. And if you want a really funny story about Bultmann, ask me afterwards and I'll tell you. I won't take your time right now. Ernst Käsemann, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, one of your former colleagues, Laura, John Meyer, one of my former colleagues, and Paula Fredrickson, just to mention a few. And the last person to give these lectures, this was not really planned, was this year's current colleague, Dale Allison from Princeton Theological Seminary. He did a wonderful job. So they have been very illustrious speakers, and we are in for a very special treat tonight. And to tell us about this year's speaker, I'm going to call on Professor Laura Nasrallah to introduce him.
Welcome. It's great to see you all, and it's great to have with us the Frederick and Margaret L. Weyerhaeuser Associate Professor of New Testament. I wasn't sure if the umlaut was very important in the U.S. Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, Eric Barreto. Eric received a BA in religion at Oklahoma Baptist University and M.Div from Princeton and a Ph.D. in New Testament from Emory, and has taught at various institutions, including teaching at Candler for a bit, and now, of course, at Princeton Theological Seminary. His writings are quite extensive and quite interesting to those of us who are very concerned about New Testament and ethnicity in particular. In 2010, he published Ethnic Negotiations, the Function of Race and Ethnicity in Acts 16. His work and commitment as well to the church, publishing for the sake of the church, are evident in some of his publications. For example, New Proclamation for Year C, Easter Through Christ the King, co-authored with David Lott, Reading Theologically, a book that he edited, and Exploring the Bible, co-authored with Michael Chan. The sort of commitment to a public voice, to a theological voice, in the midst of the rigor and the complexity of our field. One of the ways that I came into contact with Professor Barreto's work was actually in a co-authored work called In Tongues of Mortals and Angels, a deconstructive theology of God talk in Acts and Corinthians. And I'm really grateful for that, as I was thinking about glossolalia and 1 Corinthians, and also about Acts and heteroglossia as well. Right now, Professor Barreto is working on several publications, one called A People for God's Name, Theology and Ethnicity in the Acts of the Apostles, another, All of You Are One, Paul and the Construction of Ethnic Theologies, as well as a commentary on Luke for the Interpretation series. We are very fortunate also that Professor Barreto is a leader in the Hispanic Theological Initiative, and in fact a mentor of our own Hannah Baz-Garza here, and that kind of public-facing mentoring is incredibly important as well in a career. This week we'll have 3 lectures, and tonight we have the first of them, titled Reading Luke Backwards. So let's welcome together Professor Barreto. Thank you for being here.
Well, good evening, friends. Thank you, Dr. Nasrallah, for the generous introduction. Laura was up at Princeton Seminary, so I got to do that. It's really fun work to laud the friends and colleagues that you respect so dearly. Let me extend my thanks also to Dean Sterling, my friends and colleagues here, for the kind invitation and the hospitality already shown. A special thanks to Lynn Haversat for all the logistical detail work that makes all this possible. I'm deeply honored by the invitation to be here among colleagues who I respect so dearly, whose work and friendship have meant so much. Moreover, I am humbled because of the great respect I have for the school, its scholars, and its students. So thank you for being here tonight. The 3 lectures I am presenting have the overarching title of Reading Luke with Time. And Reading Luke with Time is an invitation over these next 3 nights to give critical, thoughtful attention to the texts of the Gospel of Luke, to its rich narratives and complex interpretive histories, to the theological potential these stories unlock, alongside the limitations of interpretive imagination in the past and today alike. This evening, I want us to practice a reading of Luke that looks back in narrative time, that wonders what happens when we read and reread from the end of the story back to its beginning. Tomorrow evening is a look to our present, to a specific present on an island in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, which we all agree is the most beautiful place on earth. Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate the affirmation. And tomorrow evening is an argument for rich contextualization today. And last will be a gazing into the future, an examination of how Luke might help us ponder, work toward, hope in the future in a moment of various and compounding crises. In every case, I should confess, I am reading as someone deeply interested, even called, to the way Luke's storytelling can inspire and nurture rich theological reflection. That is, I position myself in the wide enterprise of theological education, especially how our schools and our scholarship can help nurture in leaders of various vocations theological convictions that can help shape the world God creates and God loves. And so to Luke and to reading backwards. From its opening verses, the Gospel of Luke makes clear that the narrative being shared is not new exactly. The very first concession Luke makes is, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. That is, other accounts of Jesus have come before, and this gospel joins in their witness to the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In addition, Luke is narrating events that continue to unfurl in the lives of the followers of Jesus to which the gospel is addressed. Others have told the story, and the story continues to be fulfilled among us. Further, in the second verse, Luke lifts up that the stories he recounts rests on the testimonies others have given. Luke himself is not an eyewitness, and presumably also those first readers and hearers of this text first heard the good news because others bore witness too. Their reception of the gospel is not of those at the premiere of the narrative, but through memory and the recounting of those who were there or heard the story from those who were eyewitnesses. Luke does not need to include spoiler alerts when Jesus predicts a path of suffering, nor does the audience gasp when the story's hero dies on a Roman cross. Neither does the resurrection come as a shock, but as the confirmation of a story already heard, already embraced, already believed. Much like any of us, Luke only knows the stories of Jesus because someone else bore witness to them, and because that storytelling was deemed somehow trustworthy. In fact, it must be that those many who have undertaken to tell the story include not just Mark and the other written and oral traditions to which Luke has access, and the eyewitnesses and servants of the word to whom he spoke, but also the generations of prophets who pointed to God's promised future. That is, the storytelling about God, whether for Luke or for us, started long before any of us came to hear these stories. These are inherited stories all the way down. And thus, a key stance in reading Luke requires a critical but fundamental trust in the stories others weave. Last, Luke addresses Theophilus so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. To Theophilus and the first hearers of this gospel, these are not new stories, but ones in which they have already believed, that have already transformed their lives. The text's earliest auditors and readers would have encountered familiar stories, perhaps rearranged or reimagined, but stories whose power to change them they had already experienced. In short, the Gospel of Luke does not purport to tell a new story, but an old story. These aims continue as the Gospel turns to the birth narratives. Elizabeth and Zechariah recall the stories of other elderly and faithful couples who were not able to have a child without God's intervention. This has happened before. A woman sings of God's liberation. This has happened before. A woman named Anna, not so far from being called Hannah, sees God's promises made true. This has happened before. And of course, as scholars have noted, Jesus' ministry echoes the prophetic work of Elisha and Elijah, as Jesus' own proclamation begins to suggest in Luke 4. This too has happened before. But the story of Jesus is not a new story, not an innovation on God's part, not a detour on God's promises, is named narratively and literarily primarily, rather than an explicit citation of Scripture or direct confession in the gospel. But I think even more than a narrative or literary approach, this intertwining of the story of Jesus with the story of the patriarchs and the prophets is a theological confession. The same God who made promises to Israel is now fulfilling those promises through Jesus for the sake of God's people, Israel. A new story need not be told because the old story remains true and trustworthy. So one of the challenges Luke faces is telling an old story again, reminding a community of stories that once changed them and might do so again, rehearsing stories told again and again in the hope of renewal. In short, Luke's gospel expected rereading. Imagine that its first readers would not be first readers, but that they would be revisiting a story they had already known. It is a gospel that rewards, perhaps even calls for rereading. I wonder, too, if Luke assumed that his story would be read among other stories of Jesus. When Luke writes that many have undertaken to set down an orderly account, he contextualizes his storytelling among others. And there is some scholarly debate about how Luke views his narrative predecessors. It may be that Luke sees the many who have undertaken as full of shortcomings he is seeking to ameliorate. In my mind, however, Luke's generous drawing on Mark and his other sources, alongside his reliance on the eyewitnesses of others, suggests that he sees his predecessors as important models and companions in telling the story of Jesus. Companions not so easily replaced, dismissed, or worse, discarded. That is, the New Testament as we know it today starts with 4 distinct though related stories of Jesus, and the traditions that draw upon the New Testament thus are committed to our fourfold telling of the stories of Jesus. So also, I think, Luke's prologue creates room for multiple accounts of Jesus standing next to each other rather than in a zero-sum contest for singular truth. Alas, in the church where I grew up, and in too many Christian communities still, the meaning of this gospel, and especially the meaning of the cross, was and remains largely singular. The cross was the moment when God's wrath was satiated, when our sins were washed in the blood of the Lamb, when Jesus died like a sacrificial lamb. Now, these are important stories about the cross in the New Testament, but they are not the only angles of vision we might pursue. This particular account of the cross, as widespread as it might be in some communities, is not the only account to be found in the New Testament. Luke narrates the cross as a tragedy and an ultimate symbol of imperial aggression, a sign meant to evoke terror among those who would contest Roman power. The cross, according to Luke, is a miscarriage of justice. Luke's Jesus thus joins a long line of innocent people executed and whose bodies in public display are warnings against those who would challenge or even question imperial power. Salvation for Luke has social and political dimensions precisely because imperial tools like the cross have been used as implements of suffering and oppression. In the end, Jesus' suffering on the cross is a moment of accompaniment with those unnamed, uncounted others who have also been afflicted by empire's arrogations of power, and the resurrection, a wholesale rejection of such claims to dominance. Luke's cross, I think, asks us to look at lynchings and border walls, legally backed segregations, and other places of injustice as modern forms of the imperial power the cross represented and the resurrection defeated. Understood as such, the cross then helps read Luke backwards, illuminating previous stories as we reread the gospel. So let's first turn to Luke's account of the cross, when the narrative drives us to a place of death, a place of imperial violence, a place of abandonment and loss and injustice. When Christians read this text on Good Friday, we come back to a place of trauma, a trauma Christians who read these texts may not acknowledge often enough. The crosses we wear around our necks and adorn our church steeples are typically no longer symbols of such trauma. Instead, they are, or ought to be, symbols of welcome, inclusion, redemption, forgiveness, love, grace. When the first pictures of the Cathedral of Notre Dame were released after a devastating fire in 2019, a gleaming cross shown in one picture as a defiant symbol, a symbol of persistence, a symbol of hope. And this is all well and good. And I think Luke's narrative calls us to look at the cross again and feel its sharp edges. Why do Christians keep coming back to the cross? Why does every Good Friday draw them to a place of execution, a place of death, a place of loss, a place of despair? I wonder if we return to the cross, to Good Friday, because this day is a mirror reflecting the depth of our own suffering and pain and, yes, grief. What if Good Friday is not so much a day to know for certain, but a day to question, to wonder, to doubt, and to grieve? After all, the cross is the strangest of good news. The defeat of death with death. The death of empire's arrogations as the empire takes yet another innocent life. Eternal life purchased with the death of someone. Forgiveness shared at a place devoid of mercy. The cross is the strangest of good news. For the gospel writers, the cross is also a lens that clarifies and sharpens their theological vision. The disciples may struggle to comprehend Jesus, his parables, his teachings, but the cross can be clarifying in the narrative. The cross brings into sharp relief the significance of a story about seeds strewn on the ground, the restoration of a widow's son, the tears Jesus sheds in a lonely garden. The gospel writers are asking us to read forwards and then backwards. We move from sentence to sentence, but then come back to them with a new awareness once we know where the story is heading. But the cross is not singular. It does not mean one thing. Again, the fact that we have 4 distinct gospel accounts of the death of Jesus is a clear indication that no one story can capture the weight and the meaning of the cross. No one story is enough. We need many stories. And we need help to see how the cross remains meaningful today. I think in turning to Luke's story, we find that his account is distinct and vital. Luke's account brings with it a clarity about our current crises, our complicities in injustice, but also something about the source of hope and the power of God's grace. The refrain of Luke's account is Jesus' innocence. Jesus, Luke's story reiterates, is innocent. So declares Pilate, so declares one of the rebels, a terrorist in the eyes of Rome, hanging next to Jesus. In Matthew, in contrast, of course, both of those executed alongside Jesus deride him. Only in Luke does one of the pair declare Jesus' innocence. Jesus is innocent, so declares the centurion. Again, only in Luke does the centurion declare Jesus' innocence, while Mark and Matthew agree that the centurion at the foot of the cross declares Jesus to be the Son of God, an ironic declaration to make as Jesus breathed his last. But how did the centurion in Luke know he was innocent? Presumably, Jesus is neither the first nor the last person whose execution he facilitates, not the only person to claim innocence on a Roman cross. What did he see in Jesus in his final breaths that suggests his innocence? Was Jesus' death just that special? Perhaps not. I've been starting to think that the centurion does not see anything special about Jesus. The centurion did not notice something unique about Jesus. But perhaps in Jesus' innocent death, the centurion saw a deeper injustice coursing through Rome's purported justice system. Jesus' death was ordinary precisely because empires execute the innocent. Jesus' death was not unique because he's not the first nor the last person caught in the crosshairs of empire's distorted sense of justice. So in Luke, Jesus' innocence is highlighted perhaps not so much to make Jesus and Jesus alone innocent, but so that through Jesus' unjust death, readers might see that he does not hang on the cross alone. A second reaction to Jesus' death comes from the crowd gathered to bear witness to a public execution. In haunting words, Luke writes that people had gathered to see a spectacle. Spectacle suggests the curiosity of onlookers, the kind of curiosity that draws us to wonder why a crowd is gathering. Something has to be going on. Spectacle, however, intimates something even more sinister: delight. Spectacle draws us in when Romans gathered at the Colosseum, or American football fans would celebrate unironically a clip of a vicious hit, or drivers slow down to gawk at a car accident on the road, or the video clip of a gruesome moment goes viral. There is in us a strange and troubling propensity towards spectacle. There is in too many of us a certain delight in the suffering and, yes, even the death of others. Spectacle is empire's not-so-secret power. Spectacle dazes us into allegiances we might otherwise reject. Spectacle is a tool by which empire captures us in its thrall. Spectacle is a promise that violence against some will limit the scope of that violence to certain dangerous people, and not those of you drawn in by the spectacle. And in so many ways, Luke's gospel is one that resists such spectacle. Jesus' birth comes about in the context of everyday stories about infertility. It's announced to Mary alone, who exclaims a prophetic word to her cousin Elizabeth. Occurs at the center of the ancient home, surrounded by friends and family. Is witnessed by shepherds who see and hear the heavenly hosts in the lonely wilderness where they work. Jesus' meals tend to be ordinary and everyday. So also, so many of the parables draw us to everyday, unremarkable moments of joy and grief, justice and injustice alike. Spectacle haunts this narrative and haunts us still, I think. A third reaction to the cross comes in the wake of Jesus' last breath. Luke records that the crowds return home, beating their breasts. They had come out to see a spectacle, but saw something even more horrifying. They were witnesses to an unjust death, to the cruelties of the empire, to the profoundly human drive to reject and kill the prophets among us because they tell us hard truths we do not want to admit. Here we might recall when Jesus teaches that no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown in chapter 4. And when you read it then, it sounds like a prediction, as if Jesus were gazing into the future. It sounds like Jesus uttering some mysterious saying, as if he were a soothsayer. It sounds like augury or divination, as if he were a fortune teller. It sounds like prognostication, as if Jesus could peer into an uncertain future and see something the rest of us cannot. But Jesus in chapter 4 articulates an adage, not a prediction. It is not an enigma or a mystery or an oracle, but a bare fact. The simple truth laid bare in chapter 23. The prophets among us, whether in antiquity or today, are rejected for their words, marginalized for their stances, turned away because of who they are. After all, what is a prophet? A prophet is someone called to speak those hard truths that we know are true, that we all believe in our hearts but refuse to embrace in everyday life. Prophets tell us hard truths that pierce our souls. With deep love and a sense of justice, prophets point out where we have gone astray, where we have missed God's call to love the stranger, to care for the marginalized, to advocate for the widow and the orphan, the migrant and the oppressed. And precisely because of how incisive and truthful their proclamations are, we shrink away from them. The truths they utter are too difficult, too true for us to embrace. And so we too reject the prophets among us. And just to say one more thing about prophets, the true ones and the false ones, I think Jesus' simple picture of the prophets can also help us spot the false prophets among us. Spot the kind of prophets who lead us astray. Those false prophets that utter words that tickle our ears, that point to the enemies we already suspected we had, that settle us into complacency and have us buy into hopelessness. Such false prophets tell us easy truths that feed our worst instincts: fear, resentment, and grievance. Such false prophets tell us that they are not our friends, but threats. If Jesus is right that no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown, then the false prophet will seemingly always find a welcome ear, a cheering crowd, a seat at places of power and influence. Returning to chapter 23, the crowds realize they have seen something they shouldn't have seen. The reaction of the audience within the narrative is grief, the beating of breasts, a sign of regret. And so I wonder if Luke is inviting readers into such a posture too. Perhaps the reader too has been privy to an unjust death we shouldn't have seen, and in which we find ourselves complicit. Perhaps the reader too gets caught up in the thrall and the spectacle because Luke's imagined readers know the cross is only a byway to the resurrection, a failed attempt to crush the life of Jesus. Perhaps Luke knows that the reader who knows the story of the cross, who has come to find in this terrible fate a word of hope, needs to encounter the story as if for the first time. For Luke, then, the cross is not a moment of celebration and acclamation. The cross is a blunt instrument of tragedy. It's a moment of deep hopelessness. The cross shows us the depths of inhumanity. The cross is cruelty and death and violence all wrapped up into one. Moreover, in Luke's hands, the cross is a repetitive tragedy. For Jesus is neither the first nor the last innocent person crushed by the grinding wheels of imperial injustice. He's not the first or the last executed not because he was guilty, but because he lacked the political clout or material wealth or presumed immunities to acquire fairness and equity. He's not the first nor the last to die, not so much because of his guilt, but so that empire's power might be flaunted, empire's muscle flexed, empire's arrogance be placed in full display. In Luke's account, as Jesus is passed from ruler to ruler, the frailty and cruelty of Roman power is laid bare. This is not a system of justice, but a broken exercise of power that treads upon the weak and the powerless. In this way, Luke's Jesus is not alone. He is accompanied by many other anonymous victims of Rome's imperial violence. In this way, too, Jesus becomes a sibling of others unjustly executed by the powerful. Again, remember that the first reaction to Jesus' death are grief and sorrow among those who have gathered to watch a spectacle. Like crowds gathered to watch a lynching in their Sunday best, these neighbors of Jesus had looked to the spectacle of empire for some relief, some diversion, some violent display of a certain kind of false security an empire can provide. Instead, they found a mirror in the cross of Jesus, a mirror that reminds us all that we too can easily become the victims of such vicious, indiscriminate state violence, or that we too can join a crowd demanding the death of the innocent, or that we too at least might join a crowd looking for a spectacle. If such is the cross that Luke narrates, then the rest of the story can be read in a different light. For instance, we can return to Luke 20 and a trio of questions posed to Jesus. Questions meant to provoke a conflict according to the narrative. The third of those questions is a seemingly inescapable trap posed by spies sent by a certain they. That they are presumably the chief priests, scribes, and elders with whom Jesus tangles at the beginning of the chapter. And if the identity of the questioner is a bit diffuse, their motivations are not, so as to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. So they ask Jesus whether it is lawful to pay taxes to the emperor. A perfect question, for an affirmation might cause Jesus to lose the support of a crowd burdened by Roman taxation. A negative response might catch the attention of the Roman authorities. But Jesus' response stuns. He sees the trap and avoids falling in. "Show me a denarius," he says, and points to the image engraved upon it. The coin belongs to the emperor. Its value rests on his authority and power. Its weight in the pocket is a reminder of empire's encroachment into everyday life. So Jesus says, then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that belong to God. Of course, amazement and silence are the response. Of course, in popular citation of Jesus saying to render unto Caesar, the aim is virtually always to cleave the political and the religious, to encourage us to avoid mixing the sacred and the profane. Such an answer is not really awe-inducing nor all that cunning. Instead, Jesus responds as a challenge placed back to his questioners, to the readers of the gospel. After all, if Jesus were somehow to hear that a Galilean peasant was teaching that we should give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, he would not be troubled, for the world, he thinks, belongs to him. Makes me think of in Luke chapter 1 when it says, Luke chapter 2, that Caesar called for all the world to be counted, as if he could do that. However, if you were to ask a first century reader of Luke what belongs to God, the answer would be unequivocal. The world is the Lord's. And yet the weight of a coin in the pocket then, and perhaps today, the weight of a cell phone today with its rare minerals, might cause us to pause and wonder to what extent a confession of faith that the world belongs to God is reflected in everyday practice. A few more examples will emerge, especially in tomorrow's lecture, but let me share one more implication of such a reading of Luke, a reading backwards that takes us back to Mary. First, I am struck by Mary's reaction to the arrival of Gabriel. Perhaps accused of striking fear wherever he goes, Gabriel tells Mary not to fear. But the narrative does not indicate that Mary is afraid at all. Perplexed, to be sure, curious and hopeful, surely. She is perplexed in being called favored, perhaps because of her location in the interstices of empire's might. After all, what does favor from God look like in such a context? But she is curious and hopeful as she ponders the nature of the angel's greeting. Gabriel makes a number of promises about pregnancy and childbirth, but also about the destiny of this child to take up, quote, the throne of his ancestor David. Thus, when Mary wonders, how can this be since I am a virgin, in verse 34, I think the question may not focus solely or even primarily on the mechanics of conception and pregnancy, but on the promises that Gabriel made about this little boy who would rock the foundations of the world that the powerful have erected. How can it be, she asks, that a mere baby could take such a throne, could change a world so riven with death and destruction, could proliferate life in the midst of so much despair? Restricted to virginity and conception, nothing will be impossible for God, is constrained to a single miracle, vital as it might be in the Christian tradition, but that's not the only impossibility placed before Mary. She must also somehow believe that a different world, a world long foretold by God via the prophets, was not a dream but a tangible promise. With the angel's departure, Mary's first move is to go with haste to see Elizabeth. And it may be that she does so to see tangible proof of the angel's call with her own eyes. After all, Gabriel points to Elizabeth as definitive proof of God's faithful promise. But I wonder if there are at least two other possibilities in Mary's haste. First, Mary may have felt great joy for her cousin who had suffered so much. This was a moment that called for celebration. Second, it may be that Mary felt a deep need to be with someone else who had said yes to God in this dramatic and risky way. Elizabeth and Mary both may understand in a way other colonized people understand in their bones the dangerous step both have taken by believing in God's promises to turn the world upside down. cross was a tragedy for Luke. Jesus and his followers carried in their bodies the trauma of the cross, trauma foretold by Simeon to Mary, trauma so deep that it keeps two disciples from recognizing Jesus on a road, trauma so deep that Jesus carries the scars on his resurrection body, trauma so deep that the disciples so often cannot bring themselves to believe their eyes. Resurrection is thus for Luke God's definitive and transformative answer to the violence that characterizes too much of human life. Resurrection is God's response to human complicity in structures of injustice. Resurrection is God's retort when empire claims the power to take life permanently. Resurrection is a reminder that the human thrall to imperial violence, our trust in force to make things right, is a delusion. Resurrection, in contrast, is God's faithful promise that death has been defeated. And the cross for Luke is a tragedy that echoes throughout history. When readers are witnesses to Jesus' death, Luke hopes they will feel deep grief and sorrow that an innocent Jesus dies in this way. In Luke, Jesus dies the death of the innocent so that other martyrs might see their own pain etched on Jesus' face. Those who suffer in this way know that Jesus accompanies them on this path of oppression. Jesus also dies the death of the innocent so that those of us who have come out to see a spectacle might see the truth of empire's injustice and our complicity in its distortion of the shape of human life. And thus we might leave the cross transformed because we have seen him bear the pain of empire's violence. We leave transformed so that we might encounter our neighbors with the kind of love that sees the world not as it is, but how it might be when God dwells among us. Earlier, I exhorted us to see the cross of Jesus in tragic spaces all around us, in places where the innocent have died and imperial violence appears to have the last word. In these same places where death appears to rule, we can also spot the power of resurrection in ways we wouldn't be able to do so without the help of a cross that clarifies previous allegiances, the human thrall to imperial violence, the lie we love to believe that if others are in the crosshairs of empire, then we will be free. This is a picture of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, remembering the victims of lynchings throughout the country. As visitors walk through this exhibit, overhead are massive, weighty stones representing the thousands of victims whose names we do not know. These acts of public terror were designed to nurture fear in Black communities and perform spectacle in white communities. The weight of the cross on the shoulders of the innocent is here. And there is life to witness too. In Montgomery, we bear witness to the persistence of a people, the courage of a community, the boldness of a public grief that calls us to repentance, that calls us to life. This picture was taken on November 17th, 2018. It is of migrants being tear gassed at the US-Mexico border. So much of what is purported to be immigration policy is mere spectacle, meant to cow the immigrant, to encourage her to, using a ridiculous euphemism, to self-deport. The logic is that of a zero-sum economic and cultural game. If we can keep others out, maybe the benefits of empire will be ours alone. If the walls are tall enough, we can keep them out, neglecting to see that those same walls so easily can corner us in two. And for me, this picture is particularly visceral. As tomorrow's lecture will take up, it is only through the vicissitudes of colonial history that Puerto Ricans like me are counted as citizens. If history had been inflected ever so slightly differently, would this be me seeking a better life for my children? And so the weight of the cross on the shoulders of the innocent is here, and there is life to witness too. At the border, we bear witness to a faith on the move, to faith on a long and winding road leading from despair through danger and into the hope of hospitality and opportunity. After all, Jesus was once a stranger on a lonely road. Last is a picture of protests from the summer of 2020. It's a picture of a community inspired into action, having witnessed the murder of George Floyd on a street in Minneapolis. The video haunts me, especially when George Floyd calls for his mother, as the weight of the state and the kind of violence that is meant to make some of us feel safe by making others afraid is quite literally on his neck. We know all too well that Mr. Floyd is not alone in this experience. Countless others have suffered under state violence. Their stories were long told by Black and brown communities, and too many did not believe them without the video evidence. Their witness was insufficient for far too many. The weight of the cross on the shoulders of the innocent is here, and there is life to witness too. In the streets of Minneapolis, we bear witness to a community catalyzed around justice, a public roar that declares that things must change. The death we see in these tragic spaces is real, it's vivid, it's tangible, it's present. And if we do not stare that death straight in the face, we are not faithful to the kind of story Luke is inviting us to see. So often, too many of us do not want to look at the crosses around us today. But Luke didn't have a choice in telling this story. Those who have the promise of resurrection before us cannot look away. Also real in these tragic spaces is a transformative, hard-won hope. This is not a hope born of privilege and ease, but honed under the weight of empire's power. Resurrection for Luke is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. But resurrection does not wait for death, of course, in Luke. Instead, resurrection has already infiltrated death's domain, a domain where Jesus heals the sick and brings communities back together by eating with all kinds of people. Resurrection does not wait for our deaths, but invades the world. Resurrection transforms life not just when we die one day, but right here and right now. Resurrection is not a promise for which we wait. Resurrection is a reality God gives us to taste today and tomorrow and for all time. And in the end, I think it's a story Luke thinks we have not heard enough as of yet. Thank you, friends.
Thank you very much, Professor Barreto. So we have time for some questions. I would ask you to please identify yourself, even if the people sitting around you know who you are. Professor Barreto is our guest, and he won't know. So the floor is open. Who would like to pose a question? Laura, and then here. Okay, Laura first, and here.
Thank you so much for that. I'm Laura Nasrallah, teacher. Okay. Thank you so much for that moving, thoughtful, provoking lecture, moving from kind of narrative, and this has happened before, into our present moment. I wanted to say one thing and then ask a question, to mention that last week Judith Butler was here speaking on fascism and very helpfully used the phrase shameless sadism to think about the kind of spectacular nature of the present. So I felt real resonances between your talk and their talk last week.
There's that phrase, I think it was a journalist who said, like, the cruelty is the point.
Yeah, right, and there was a randomness of the spectacular nature across, So I wanted to hear more from you maybe about the idea of witness. It just, you use the phrase quite a bit, the word quite a bit towards the end. I'm thinking about the idea of martyr, martyres in Greek. I didn't know if you wanted to take that up as an invitation.
Yeah, I think, I do wonder part of what the narrative is doing is calling us to be witnesses of the cross as an event, especially if Luke's first readers and auditors are folks who have already known the story, who think they know what it looks like to witness to that. But then being caught up in that thrall of imperial violence causes us to shift our sense of what it means to be a witness of the cross. The other place I think I would think about too is that call that Jesus places in Acts chapter 1. Says, "You will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth." And I think there's a way to read the book of Acts that what it means to bear witness to the ends of the earth is to perform all that sermonizing that happens throughout the book of Acts, all that talking about who God is and who Jesus is. But what I know in the tradition where I grew up, it missed this, and I think sometimes I miss this too, is that a lot of the witness bearing that happens in the book of Acts is folks catching up to things that the Spirit is doing already ahead of them. So when Philip meets the Ethiopian eunuch in the middle of nowhere, the prophets and the Spirit have already been acting on them. They're not starting from scratch. And I wonder too, if part of what's happening in that narrative is not just Philip changing the eunuch, but Philip's encounter with this eunuch also transforming Philip's own imagination. That witness bearing isn't just, I know things, I will tell you, but it is this sense that God is moving ahead of us, that the world is suffused with God's presence, and therefore anyone we meet has already had the Spirit somehow moving in their own lives. So I do think witness is this theme that runs through Luke Acts that I think is important and vital for us. The other place I think about it, and I allude to this in the lecture some, is I think the call to witness is also a call to trust, especially when we are called to trust the witness of marginalized communities. So again, Black and brown communities have been telling stories about their encounters with police for generations. But it took videotape, and especially having these things in our pockets, to make those stories feel believable to too many people. So part of the witness bearing that we're called to is, I think, this fundamental trust in the stories others tell, not because they're 100% right or because they always get everything right, but with the assumption that Luke Acts has, that I think that the world, again, is full of God's presence, God's activity, and therefore the stories that marginalized people are telling are necessarily full of God's Spirit, even if they're not always 100% right. It's this fundamental trust that we're being called to listen to the stories others tell. So it's another lecture. Thank you.
All right, right here.
Thank you so much. Nick Gordon, first year M.Div.
Awesome.
I really appreciate so much of the reading that you gave us of the crucifixion. And I'm particularly interested in your speaking of the centurion and about both the reading of this scene as a completely innocent scene, but also a scene that is seen as ordinary or, not special.
Repetitive, yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
and repetitive.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in looking at the fact that the centurion also praises God in claiming the innocence. How do you read that? How should we be reading that? Because I think it's interesting that it's both claiming an innocence that's occurring in an empire, but also praising God for that innocent execution.
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. Thank you for that. I think one place I might go is I find that part of the story so unbelievable, right? I think that's part of it is it doesn't make any sense. So Don Jewell, who used to teach at Princeton Seminary, famously, when he was taught Mark, when he would get to that point in Mark's account, when certainly this is God's son, he had a very distinctive voice, would read that with just dripping with sarcasm. Right? So imagine the centurion not, oh my goodness, this is God's son, but yeah, look, here's God's son for you. So there is something to me unbelievable about the confession of innocence that I think has more to do with how, putting us, not what the centurion said, or what the centurion might have presumably and conceivably have said, but to put ourselves in the narrative and imagine us making that confession in that moment. And that Jesus' innocence, again, isn't about isolating him from the rest of humanity, but placing him alongside all these other innocents folks. It's I think to believe that the centurion would say that just kind of extends the bounds of incredulity. And I wonder if that's part of the magic of the narrative. It just doesn't make any sense, and yet it points to this fundamental truth. Does that get to it somewhere? Is there any follow-up that you want to think about that with me? Okay. It's a great question. It's an angle I hadn't thought about. I think also in the back, question as well? Awesome.
Hi, Teresa Morgan. I teach here.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. One thing I wonder whether you could say a bit more about, especially in light of the very powerful last section of the modern section of this lecture, is the role of collusion as well as innocence and oppression in the crucifixion narrative, since the crowd that goes home beating its breast and saying, what how horrifying thing has happened, is kind of, at least presumptively within the narrative, very much the same crowd that only a few verses earlier has said crucify him. Yeah. So, and what Jesus is calling everyone to is repentance and the seeking of forgiveness. So there is a strong implication that everybody is involved. This is not a stark division between the oppressors and the oppressed.
Right. Yeah.
There's a layer of collusion going on in this too. So I wonder if you can say a bit more about how you work that into the argument.
No, that's really, really helpful. I think the threat of complicity and collusion, I think, is important in thinking about this. I think I might talk about this a little bit more tomorrow as well. The complicated postures that the colonized often have to take, both in resisting the forces of oppression, but then also participating in it, I think is something worth theorizing more and exploring more together. I think one of the things the narrative might be trying to do is again, if people have already heard this story and have been transformed by the story, then bringing them back to the cross means maybe that Luke's audience is already seeing this as a spectacle, that enough time has gone by that it's not so scary, not so frightening, but that it becomes something to celebrate, something to acclaim. And part of what the narrative does is to put the mirror back on us and to see the many ways that we find ourselves complicit in empire's power then, and perhaps still today. I think I want to think more about that, but I think there is this question of complicity that I think is really important, and I want to keep thinking about this more. Thank you. Great question.
Elisha McAllister, second year M.Div. Thank you so much for this. I was sincerely moved to tears at certain points. Very beautiful. So I have a theory, which I'm sure some others share, but I think that a lot of people who were a part of the human-owning class were very pissed off that slavery was outlawed in 1865 and have been consistently, strategically, slowly building through like hoarding of wealth, resources. We now find ourselves in a place where they bought the election and bought different aspects of government, so on and so forth. I think that's all meant to culminate in making sure that we don't go a full 200 years without the institution of chattel slavery. I mean, we already have it in prison systems as is, like it's legal. But for those of us that do recognize that this is a legitimate and likely scenario that we are marching steadily towards, on the topic of serving as a competent witness, what is your advice? How might we best serve as public theologians so that others might heed the call, and maybe we can throw a wrench in the gears before we get to 2065 and we've turned a full 360 and right back where we left?
My friend Heath Carter is an American historian at the seminary. And he tells a story about a local leader in Selma, Alabama, who started, was, I think, if I remember right, was the first black woman to vote in Selma, decades before the March on Selma. Was working locally for decades on this work. And she was there when they marched across the bridge. And she was also there to remember the events of Selma when Barack Obama came to town. And she's, in the picture you see her, she's in a wheelchair, she's in her 90s at that point. So within her lifetime, she saw the depths of Jim Crow segregation, the possibilities of the passage of legislation and protests and the way that transformed the world, to a black man being president all in her lifetime. I don't think she lived to 2016, but it's conceivable, right, that someone could have lived that whole span of life. And so for me, that what's instructive in that is that, and I think it's instructive in this account of the cross, is that the death of the innocent and the flexing of empire's power has been around for a long, long time. I think it's important to name that and to lament that, but that alongside that have always been deeply faithful prophetic people who've sacrificed a great deal for the sense of some distant hope. I'll talk more about this in Thursday's lectures about kind of the shaping of hope. But I think knowing what kind of scale do we imagine our work and our service and our witness? And if it's isolated just to my lifetime, then it can feel like that witness bearing won't produce much fruit. But if we see our witness today being part of generations of witness that have gone before us, and hopefully a witness that comes after us, then I think we see ourselves as this chain of resistance and hope and despair and grief all wrapped up together. So I think the advice is to lean into that call and know that we're not first and that we're not last. And the work continues.
Okay, sir, we can take, yes, in the back, the last question.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Barreto.
Hello.
Carlos, first year MAR in Hebrew Bible here.
Princeton Seminary graduate.
Yeah, it's great to see you. One thing that really, that I clung to from your lecture was this idea of spectacle. Because I can't help but think that you came from New Jersey, and right now, New Jersey State Senator Cory Booker is filibustering right now against Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
Is he still going?
Yeah, I think if he's going right now, it should be around 24 hours that he's been speaking on the floor. What function does counter-spectacle have within the context of empire? Does Luke give us anything? I'm thinking about like the ascension.
Yeah.
I mean, no one was really there for the resurrection besides a few, but does Luke give us anything for that? And is there anything that's applicable for the here and now for us?
That's a good question, Carlos. So I wonder if I might, the kind of spectacle, maybe the ascension really trips me up, because I was thinking about this direction. Maybe I might come back to the ascension. But that the spectacle of everyday practices of healing, of eating, the everyday stories I mentioned of infertility and hope that are embedded, like that maybe that kind of everyday faithful resistance that doesn't get onto the news, it's itself a form of spectacle. So maybe it's that we're not so dazzled by the spectacle of the powerful that we miss the spectacle of everyday faithful life. So one of the things I've been trying to practice and probably failing miserably is that last time around, I paid a lot of attention to all the press conferences and all the silly things. And is there a way to not buy into the spectacle? Because part of the function of the spectacle is distraction and dismay. And to think really clearly about the everyday, unremarkable spectacle of life lived faithfully. But now the ascension is really, it's a problem. So we should talk more about this. I want to think about that with you, Carlos. Thank you.
All right, well, you can all think about it over a glass of wine. We do have a reception this evening in the Cole Entrance Hall, so you're invited to that. Don't forget, tomorrow night, we're going to be hearing about a very beautiful island.
Correct.
Maybe a slightly different description, but I do think Puerto Rico is quite lovely. I agree. And then Thursday night, that's the present. Thursday night will be the future. But would you join me in thanking Professor Barreto for helping?
Thank you, friends. Appreciate it. Thank you.